earlier today we saw public opinion data that seems to prioritize national concerns, but also strongly emphasizes a need to consider local environmental and social impacts. And so my general question, which you alluded to, Guy, is how do we thread that needle? In particular, though, we've heard quite a bit of conversation about the question of consultation versus engagement, right? Consultation meaning listening, but perhaps not necessarily doing anything, whereas I tend to sort of characterize engagement as you have the opportunity to impact the process. You have an opportunity to create change, and we've heard some examples of that from some of our other folks. And so, two-part question here, right? How do we handle this balance between national concerns and then local environmental social impacts? And then also in terms of local communities and that engagement process, should they be looking to affect the process and potentially affect the development or with the developer or with the regulator? And so I'll throw both of it. It's kind of a two-part question there. I apologize for the complexity.
Well, if I can, I'll venture to
right
set my toe in the water out. Addressing part two, in our experience, a little bit of both. We had an experience with our Pickering nuclear plant going back into the 90s where it was really not well welcomed into the community. There was a number of, as I always preach that to our operational people, the best public relations is good operations. If you guys operate properly, I don't have any issues. They forgot that lesson, and so there was a lot of public issues. And as part of the regulatory process, what was now the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission put in, I think it was 137 things that we had to address with the community. They said, well, we'll give you a license, but you have to come back and you have to have addressed all of these conditions. And that struck up a community liaison committee that would work through a number of these issues. So it was an enforced engagement process that took a number of years to walk through. I don't know that we would have done it if the regulator hadn't said to do it. It certainly forced a change of mind in the company, how we deal with these things, and we put them very quickly into place at our other plants. And they deal with fundamental things like noise, traffic, other issues. Where that you don't get down into is your fundamental right to be there. Becomes a more, I think that's a more problematic issue. Is okay, these are all kind of nice things, but if you get down to it, I don't actually want you there. That becomes a really challenging issue. But on the company side, that's where I get into the point of having engagement with people that can actually decide things, that know that I can change the path of this. The building may not go away, but I can make the building look differently. I can talk to you about equity. I can talk to you about operations because I've got the authority to do that. And in our context, we call this a zipper effect, where depending on the level of conversation, you bring in the senior people up into the president and CEO to have those conversations depending on what needs to be decided. So a little bit of both.
Great. Anybody else on the panel want to tackle that question? Great.
Yeah, I mean, like trying to figure out how you can simultaneously address very context-specific local matters while considering the larger national implications of a project is always going to be tricky. And I think it rests in being able to make a distinction between the regulator and the policymaker. So to say the policymaker at the provincial, territorial, and federal level have that obligation to articulate the broader, longer-term vision that this single project fits into, and the regulator and the project proponent have the obligation to engage and address the local considerations associated with that single project. And those things have to happen well and simultaneously. And we don't necessarily see those things play out. And when we do, I think there are often contradictions between the ways in which people feel they might be able to engage at the local level versus the ways in which they are judging the outcome of conversations around the articulation of the longer-term vision at the provincial or federal level, or vice versa, people may feel that they are seeing something that they like in terms of the articulation of the longer-term vision, but then feel that they have no ability to wrestle with that local authority so that the outcome of decision-making at the local level actually matches up with what they're seeing at the larger scale. And I actually feel like a lot of the tension that we experience in Canada around energy decision-making has to do with the contradictions between those scales. We see that on a pretty regular basis. And so yeah, for me, it's a question of like, okay, so how do we get to that place where we are somehow aligning the articulation of that longer-term vision with the project-by-project decision-making? And so, you know, I would say, actually, in response to some of your comments around pipelines, Roxanne, from my perspective, some of the opposition, and this is probably not all of it, but some of the opposition to pipelines is this idea of like, once you build it, it's there for 40, 50 years, and then it can only do one thing for a very long period of time. And so people have a lot of folks that I've spoken to who have concerns over the building of pipelines aren't necessarily opposed to some of the shorter term objectives that might be associated with that pipeline, but they're very concerned about the ways in which that pipeline contradicts the future that we want to be building. And so I think that maybe there's like a longer term scope that has to be brought into some of these conversations that is often missing.
Great. Anybody else? Yeah, sure.
I can completely understand what you're saying, Catherine, but at the same time, I think there has to be some, or should be, in my view, some recognition of the fact that the companies who are building those pipelines or who are producing the energy that goes through those pipelines, they're also key to the transition that I think people that's leading people to question, why are we building the infrastructure? That those are the companies that are going to be key to moving us from where we are to where I think we all agree we need to be, and lower carbon. And so to not recognize that just continues the polarization. So we need to be able to bridge those gaps and have a conversation about what does that mean in the long term, and find ways to pull that together as a country, because it's the innovation in the energy sector that's got us to where we are today in terms of being able to start that significant reduction in emissions and other transitions. It's companies like Enbridge that are investing billions of dollars in renewables, not tens of millions, billions of dollars. And without some recognition that we have to be able to have a conversation about and bridge that gap, we're never going to get there. So I just think that we need to kind of acknowledge that and move forward to have that conversation. Otherwise, we'll never get anywhere, and we'll just be having the kinds of conversations we have, and nobody wants that to continue, I don't think, because it's not productive.
And I might add that we lack sometimes a policy vision when we're trying to implement renewables, and there is resistance to renewables by local communities, not having a clearly articulated national vision about how and why that's important to do that, and that may have been part of the problem in Saint-Valentin and certainly in other kinds of communities, right? We don't have all the pieces. I'm going to throw out one other question, and then in the interest of time, I'll open it up to the floor. But this may be a more difficult, a little bit of a pokey question. Similarly, our survey work seemed to show, right, that Canadians feel that the national government is not balancing the concerns of local communities that are affected by local energy projects, and that's both Indigenous and municipalities, with broader provincial or national goals, but it's not really clear why, and we don't have a good indication from our opinion data. So I'll throw this out to you. do we think that Canadians feel that local communities are actually not having their concerns properly addressed, or that local communities are actually circumventing our national goals?
Yeah.
Or both.
Yeah.
In our engagement with communities, it's rarely that we have a conversation about national goals. You know, I mean, it's not, we don't sit down and have a discussion about climate change policy. It's all about what is important to that community on a local level. And I think what we've experienced is that if you can address those local concerns and then meet the national goals that are supposed to be expressed through the regulatory process, then you can square that circle. But if there's kind of lack of clarity on what those national goals are, or if you can't or are unwilling to address local concerns, then you're going to run into problems on both sides. But that, I think that, you know, like I said, we don't have conversations with local municipal officials about climate change policy. It's about where their water intake is located, and it's about what we're going to do when we fix the roads after we've been through with construction equipment. Those are the conversations we have with them, and that's what their priorities are.
Yeah, I would agree. We don't, in our case, we're often dealing with provincial goals. So in our case, a lot of the projects, we just finished 3 hydroelectric stations that nobody really knows were built, but which is not a bad thing, like your pipelines. And our gas plant, other gas plants, the wind farms, et cetera, were all part of a broader policy decision to get off coal, which was, to the point of the research, was hugely embraced. It was like almost universal acceptance. But then when you got down to the local level, there was a lot of resistance too. Why do you, well, I understand the policy, but I don't want to be part of the solution. Move that solution over there. And so we did find, to your point, like the city officials could care less. It really was road allowances, all that sort of thing. On the private conversations, people did get it. They just didn't want to be part of it. It's like that. Yeah, I don't want to be part of the solution. Let the solution go someplace else. So it's a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about large energy projects is that very often the impact or the benefit is broadly distributed, whereas the impact or the negative impacts are very locally distributed. And so you're absolutely right that we see a lot of these conversations unfolding not just around fossil fuel infrastructure, but also around renewable energy infrastructure. And I think some lessons that we've learned from the build out of wind energy, for instance, in Canada, is that you have to spend a long time figuring out how to articulate the local benefit, and making sure that you have policies that lock that local benefit in. And I think Bruce Cameron, who's in the audience from Nova Scotia, can speak to the fact that when you do thinking around how to lock in that local benefit and also build up the capacity of decision makers to have conversations with communities that will be impacted by local projects, it can go a long way to securing buy-in for the building of those projects.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think First Nations, Métis communities right across Western Canada, right across the country for that matter. I think provincial politicians, premiers, ministers alike need to make sure that they're not muffling the voices of the First Nations people and the people in Canada regarding policy direction around renewables and whether clean coal technology is the way of the future in Saskatchewan or in North Dakota or wherever. But I think there's a lot of opportunities, I think, for green infrastructure, developing the lower cost. I think lower cost of solar and wind is just getting cheaper and cheaper. So there's opportunities there to look at back to what the net benefit of major projects are to the country in terms of how we sew in First Nations and Métis interests and rights and all of those things that really matter to all Canadians. And when we say all Canadians, I would like to think that includes us, but it sometimes does and it sometimes doesn't, based on convenience. And so I think we need to kind of stop playing that game and, you know, playing off of one another, rights versus whether major projects go forward or not. And so I think we need some boldness. We need some real leadership. We need, I think, the courage of all Canadians to decide what the future looks like for energy security for the entire country, and that includes Northern Canada and provincial norths and many parts where just have been forgotten. So I know in Enbridge, one of their subsidiaries, were looking at a flare to power generation project, and good for them. Nobody knows it. I think they're the third largest renewable energy producer in the country. Second. Oh, second. I thought you were third. Okay, from third to second. So I think you're doing excellent work. But yeah, I think just to make sure that Indigenous voices are included at the national conversation, and we're not there yet. So we need to take that seriously.